Cleopatra, a sleep story. There is a city at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea where the water is a particular shade of blue-green that you do not find anywhere else in the world, a color that sits between turquoise and sapphire and seems to hold within it both the depth of the open sea and the luminous clarity of shallow water over white sand, and where the light that falls on this water comes from a sun that is different from the sun of other places. Brighter and more direct and more generous, a sun that makes the white stone buildings of the city shimmer at midday as if they are lit from within, and that in the early morning and the late afternoon lays a long gold warmth across everything, across the harbor and the rooftops and the wide streets and the great library and the palace that sits near the water with its gardens open to the sea breeze. This city was Alexandria, built on the edge of the Egyptian delta, founded by Alexander the Great more than 2,000 years ago, and it was here, in the most cosmopolitan and most beautiful city in the ancient world, in a palace of white marble and painted corridors and rooms that smelled of cedarwood and lotus blossom and the salt of the nearby sea, that a child was born around the year 69 before the Common Era, a girl who would grow up to become one of the most remarkable rulers the ancient world produced, the last queen of Egypt, the woman whose name was Cleopatra. The Palace of Alexandria was not a single building but a collection of buildings, spread along the eastern harbor of the city, connected by colonnaded walkways and enclosed gardens and small courtyards where fountains played in the heat of the afternoon and the sound of water was a constant gentle presence in the rooms nearby. It sat on a slight rise above the harbor, and from its upper rooms and from the wide terraces that looked northward you could see the whole spread of the harbor below, the ships at anchor with their sails furled and their rigging a forest of thin lines against the sky, and beyond them the open sea, blue and immense and shimmering in the distance, and on a small island connected to the city by a long causeway, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, which stood more than 100 meters tall and whose light could be seen, it was said, 30 miles out to sea, and which was one of the 7 wonders of the world, a structure so tall and so extraordinary that people who had sailed from other ports and seen many cities and many harbors said there was nothing like it anywhere else in the world. The royal family that occupied this palace was the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greeks who had ruled Egypt for more than 250 years by the time Cleopatra was born, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who had taken Egypt as his portion of Alexander's enormous empire after Alexander died young in Babylon. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt with considerable success, building Alexandria into the cultural and intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, founding the great library that held perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world, attracting the most brilliant scholars and scientists and poets of the age to the city, making of Alexandria a place where the boundaries between Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and Persian and all the other cultures of the ancient world were unusually porous, where ideas moved across those boundaries and generated new ideas in the crossing. Cleopatra grew up in this world, in the palace with its painted walls and its view of the harbor, in the city with its wide streets and its mixed populations and its extraordinary library, and she absorbed it all with the quality of attention that distinguished her from most of the people around her, the quality of attention that was, by all the evidence of her later life, her most fundamental characteristic. She was, by all historical accounts, a person of exceptional and wide-ranging intelligence, a woman who spoke 9 or more languages including Egyptian, which none of her Ptolemaic ancestors had bothered to learn, speaking always to the Egyptians they ruled through interpreters, treating the native language of their kingdom as something beneath their attention. That Cleopatra not only learned Egyptian but made the learning of it a conscious part of how she presented herself as queen, presenting herself not as a Greek ruler of Egypt but as a pharaoh in the ancient tradition, a divine being in the Egyptian religious sense, the daughter of the gods Isis and Ra, tells you a great deal about the quality of mind she possessed, its pragmatic shrewdness combined with genuine cultural curiosity, its understanding that the management of a kingdom depended on the feelings of its people and that the feelings of the Egyptian people were bound up with their ancient religion and their sense of the divine sanction of their rulers. The childhood in the palace would have been a childhood of great beauty and considerable complexity. Beauty because the Ptolemaic court was an environment of extraordinary aesthetic refinement, where the finest things from the entire known world, Greek sculpture and Egyptian goldwork and Syrian glass and Roman silver and spices from Arabia and India, came together in a concentrated display of wealth and taste that was meant to announce to every visitor and every subject that this was the greatest court in the world, and complexity because the court of a Hellenistic dynasty was also a place of real and constant danger, where the question of succession was never finally settled, where siblings and uncles and advisors were always potentially rivals, where the history of the Ptolemaic family included a long and bloody series of murders and depositions that made the palace, for all its beauty, a place where the awareness of threat was never entirely absent from the back of the mind. The days of childhood in the palace had a rhythm that was given by the court, by the schedule of lessons and ceremonies and the movement of the household through its daily routines, but within this rhythm there was, for a child of Cleopatra's particular nature, a great deal of latitude for the kind of free and wide-ranging attention that she seems always to have possessed. She would wander in the palace gardens in the mornings before her lessons began, the gardens that extended from the back of the palace toward the city and that were kept in the elaborate formal style of the Hellenistic royal garden, with their geometric beds of flowers and their clipped hedges and their fountains and their carefully arranged perspectives, but that also contained, in their less formal margins, the kind of natural complexity that a curious child could lose herself in for hours. The small lizards sunning on the warm stone of the fountain rims and the birds in the fig trees and the insects moving through the flowers in their purposeful way, each one a small event worth observing, worth following with the eye for the few seconds or minutes of its passage through the frame of attention. The sea was always audible from the palace, and on days when the wind came off the water the smell of it filled the rooms and the corridors and the gardens with its salt-clean freshness, a smell that was entirely different from the smell of the river or the smell of the desert that lay to the south and that sometimes, when the camps in blue from the interior, arrived in Alexandria as a dry and dusty warmth that hung in the air for days. Cleopatra grew up knowing these different qualities of air and finding in them information, the wind off the sea meaning ships coming and trade arriving and letters from Rome or from the cities of the east, the wind from the south meaning the heat of the interior and the news from Upper Egypt, the still air of calm mornings meaning the city at its own pace, undisturbed by either sea or desert. The library was, from early in her life, the place she returned to most often outside the formal routines of her education, not because she was sent there but because she chose to go, because the library was the place where the question she was currently carrying could be given more material to work with, where the thread of an idea could be followed further than any single teacher could take it, where the accumulated thought of centuries was available to be argued with and built upon. She was not a passive reader but an active one, not a person who absorbed what the scrolls contained and accepted it but one who questioned it and tested it and set it against other things she had read and other things she had observed, building from the library's holdings her own understanding of the world, an understanding that was, by the time she came to power, more extensive and more rigorous than that of almost anyone else of her age or rank. She was educated in the way that the children of the Ptolemaic court were educated, by tutors who were among the most learned men of the time, educated in Greek literature and philosophy and rhetoric and mathematics and astronomy and music, educated in the encyclopedic way of the Hellenistic world, where the ideal of the educated person was someone who had encountered all the major domains of human knowledge and could move between them with ease. The Library of Alexandria was, in a very real sense, her classroom, the great accumulated knowledge of the ancient world available to her in its scrolls and codices, and she seems to have used it not merely as a student going through the required texts but as someone with a genuine and wide curiosity who followed the threads of knowledge wherever they led, reading the Egyptian religious texts as well as the Greek philosophical ones, the Aramaic and the Hebrew scriptures as well as the Latin histories, moving through the library with the freedom of someone who belongs there and for whom the whole of human knowledge is a legitimate field of interest. She was a linguist of extraordinary gifts. The 9 or more languages that Cleopatra spoke were not equally present in her daily life. Greek was the language of the court and of administration, the language in which the documents of state were written and the language in which the educated people of Alexandria conversed among themselves, a rich and flexible language with a philosophical and literary tradition of extraordinary depth and breadth that she had absorbed from her earliest education. Egyptian was the language of the temples and the countryside, the language of the priests and the farmers and the vast majority of her subjects, the language in which the gods were addressed and in which the ancient traditions of the pharaonic culture were preserved and transmitted, and her mastery of it was both practically useful and symbolically important, a statement about her relationship to her kingdom and to the people whose queen she was. Latin was the language of Rome and therefore the language of power in the Western Mediterranean, the language in which the most important political correspondence was conducted and in which the historical record that mattered most to the Romans was being written, and she spoke it well enough to converse with Caesar and Antony without interpreters, which was itself a political advantage. The advantage of hearing what a person actually says rather than what an interpreter has decided to convey. Aramaic was the commercial language of the eastern trade routes, the lingua franca of the merchants and the caravan traders who connected the Mediterranean world to the world of Arabia and Mesopotamia and Persia, and Hebrew was the language of the substantial Jewish community in Alexandria that was one of the most important communities in the city and one that required careful and respectful management. Ethiopian and the other languages she is said to have known extended her reach still further, into the kingdoms of the African interior and the trading partners of the south. To speak a language is to enter the world it describes, and Cleopatra's facility with languages was a form of entry into multiple worlds simultaneously, a capacity for multiple forms of understanding that was inseparable from her capacity for governance, because governance is ultimately the management of human beings and human beings are most fully themselves in their native tongue, express themselves most completely and most honestly in the language they grew up in, and a ruler who cannot hear that language cannot fully hear the people she governs. The languages she is recorded as speaking included Greek, which was her native tongue, and Egyptian, and Latin, and Aramaic, and Hebrew, and Ethiopian, and at least several others, and this facility with language was not merely a social accomplishment but a form of intelligence, a way of being in the world that allowed her to enter the mental and emotional life of the people she encountered in a way that those who can only speak one language cannot, to hear not just the words of the people she governed but the rhythms and the connotations and the cultural weight that the words carried in their native tongue, to understand from the inside what her Egyptian subjects meant when they spoke of the goddess Isis and what her Jewish subjects meant when they spoke of their covenant with their god and what the Alexandrian traders meant when they discussed the trade winds in the Greek that was the commercial language of the Eastern Mediterranean. The death of her father, Ptolemy XII, left Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as joint rulers of Egypt, she being around 17 or 18 years old at the time and her brother around 10. This arrangement was not unusual for the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had a tradition of co-regency between siblings, but it was always inherently unstable, a competition waiting to happen, and it did happen, as it had happened many times before in Ptolemaic history. Within a few years of their father's death, when Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria by her brother's advisors and went into exile in the eastern part of Egypt, near the border with Syria. This period of exile, which lasted perhaps a year, was a period of genuine difficulty and genuine danger, a period in which Cleopatra was not a queen in a palace surrounded by luxury and learning but a person trying to maintain a claim to power against active opposition, gathering what forces she could, managing what resources she had, making the calculations of the politically astute mind that she possessed about what options were available and which of them were most likely to succeed. She was not yet 25 years old. She was in the desert. The exile in the eastern desert was a period of genuine hardship that deserves more attention than the dramatic events that followed it tend to allow. She was, in those months, not a queen in any practical sense but a person living in the margins of her own kingdom, dependent on the goodwill of the tribes and the local administrators of the eastern borderlands, working with whatever military resources she could assemble, which were limited, maintaining the authority of her position through the force of her personality and the clarity of her political intelligence in conditions that would have broken a less formidable person. She was also learning, in those months, the reality of her kingdom from a perspective she had not previously had, the perspective of someone moving through it without the protective distance of the court, encountering the actual conditions of the people who lived in the desert margins and the border towns and the farming communities of the eastern delta, people whose relationship to Alexandria and to the Ptolemaic court was mediated by taxes and administrators and the distant rumor of royal authority rather than by any direct experience of the palace and its world. What she learned from this encounter would have informed her later governance in ways that no amount of reading or report reading could have provided, giving her a ground-level understanding of the country that was, in its own way, as valuable as the knowledge she had acquired from the library. The desert itself was a presence that could not be ignored, vast and ancient and indifferent to human arrangements, spreading south and east from the thin green ribbon of the Nile Delta into a landscape that was utterly unlike the cultivated country she had grown up in, a landscape of rock and sand and the occasional startling green of an oasis, a landscape where the scale of things was different, where the sky was enormous and the distances were enormous and the human figure was very small in relation to both, and where the silence at night was the most complete silence she had ever heard, broken only by the wind and the occasional distant sound of a desert animal, and where the stars were more numerous and more brilliant than they ever appeared from the city, the Milky Way visible as a broad river of light across the dark sky, the same stars that the Egyptian astronomers had mapped and named and given the shapes of their gods, present and available and unchanged by any human event. Or near it, in the eastern margins of the Egyptian world, far from the palace and the library and the blue harbor of Alexandria, and what she was learning in those months of exile was a kind of knowledge that the library could not provide, the knowledge of what it felt like to have power and to lose it and to work to recover it, the knowledge of her own will in a situation of genuine adversity. The situation that resolved her exile was the arrival in Egypt of Julius Caesar, who came to Alexandria in the autumn of 48 before the Common Era in pursuit of his enemy Pompey, who had been defeated in the civil war that was reshaping the Roman world and who had fled to Egypt hoping for refuge. Caesar was, at this point, the most powerful man in the Roman world, a man in his early 50s who had spent his adult life in almost constant military and political activity, who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon and defeated his rivals and written accounts of his own campaigns in a Latin prose of remarkable clarity and elegance, a man of enormous energy and ambition who was also, by all accounts, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and genuine aesthetic sensibility, a man who could appreciate the library of Alexandria and the quality of the queen who belonged to it. Cleopatra came to him, according to the famous story, wrapped in a carpet or a sacking bundle, smuggled into the palace past the guards of her brother who were watching for her, unrolled before the Roman general in a gesture that combined the practical necessity of secrecy with a theatrical audacity that was entirely characteristic. Whether the carpet story is literally true or is an embellishment that grew over the centuries of retelling, the essential truth it captures is authentic, that Cleopatra went to Caesar directly, took the initiative of meeting him on her own terms and in her own time, and that the meeting that followed was the beginning of a relationship that would shape the last decade of her life and the history of the Mediterranean world. The Alexandria that Caesar arrived in that autumn of 48 was a city he had heard described many times but that, by all evidence, surpassed his expectations when he actually encountered it. Rome was the capital of the world in the political and military sense, the city from which power radiated outward across the known world, but Alexandria was the capital in the cultural and intellectual sense, the city where the knowledge of the world was gathered and where the most brilliant minds of the age had gathered to work with it, and Caesar, who was himself a man of genuine intellectual distinction, who had written his Gallic Wars in a Latin of remarkable precision and clarity and who had proposed a reform of the Roman calendar based on Egyptian astronomical calculations, felt in Alexandria the particular pleasure of a mind that has found an environment equal to its curiosity. He walked through the library with Cleopatra as his guide, which was the most extraordinary kind of guided tour that the ancient world could offer, a walk through 5 centuries of accumulated human knowledge in the company of the person who knew it best, and she showed him not just the famous texts, the Iliad and the works of Aristotle and the mathematical treatises of Euclid, but the more obscure texts, the Egyptian religious writings and the Babylonian astronomical tables and the Indian mathematical texts that had arrived in Alexandria through the long chains of trade that connected the Mediterranean world to the world beyond it, texts that Rome did not possess and that represented kinds of knowledge that the Roman tradition had not developed. Caesar spent the winter in Alexandria, the winter of 48 to 47 before the Common Era, and the time he spent there must have been, for a man of his particular qualities, one of the most interesting periods of a life that was never short of interest. He was in the most cultivated city in the world, with access to the greatest library in the world, in the company of a woman who was one of the most intelligent people of her age, and despite the political urgency of the situation, the Alexandrian War that broke out around them and that required his military attention, he seems to have found in Alexandria and in Cleopatra's company something that was genuinely nourishing to a mind that had spent most of its decades in the practical world of military and political affairs, and that was now, in these winter months beside the Mediterranean, in the presence of the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world and the company of someone who had made herself the mistress of it. The Nile was close. The great river that was the source and the sustenance of Egypt, that had been flooding and receding and depositing its rich silt on the delta for thousands of years before the first Ptolemy ever set foot in the country, that had made Egypt the most fertile and the most reliably productive agricultural land in the ancient world, was not far from Alexandria, and Cleopatra understood the Nile in the deep way that every Egyptian ruler had to understand it, understood its rhythms and its flooding, and the meaning of the annual inundation for the planting and the harvest and the whole vast complex of Egyptian agriculture and Egyptian religion, the river being not just a geographical feature but a sacred force, the god happy in his blue-green form rising from the depths of the land to spread his fertility across the delta. She and Caesar took a journey up the Nile in the spring of 47, traveling on a great barge with a retinue of soldiers and attendants, moving slowly up the wide river through the flat landscape of the delta and then into the narrower valley of Upper Egypt, past the farming villages with their mud brick houses and their date palms and their small boats on the river, past the ancient temples that stood at intervals along the bank, their great pylon facades rising above the flat land and their painted interior walls dimly visible through the gate openings, the images of gods and pharaohs in their formal poses, the hieroglyphic inscriptions running in long columns beside them, the whole weight of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization pressing out from the stone. This journey up the Nile was one of the formative experiences of Cleopatra's reign, and not only for the political purposes it served, the demonstration to her Egyptian subjects that their queen was touring her realm and attending to their welfare and presenting herself as the heir of the ancient pharaonic tradition. It was also a journey of seeing, of moving through the physical reality of the country she ruled at the pace of a river current, which is a very gentle pace, a pace that allows for the kind of sustained and unhurried observation that reveals things invisible at any faster speed, the way the light on the water changes as the river curves and the bank shifts from east to west, the way the birds move in and out of the papyrus marshes at the edge of the water, the way the farmers work their fields. In the early morning when the heat has not yet built to its midday intensity, the patient and methodical work of people who have been farming this particular land for generations beyond counting and who know its rhythms in their bones. The barge would have moved slowly, carried by the current and sometimes helped by oarsmen, and in the long warm afternoons when the sun was high and the banks were shimmering in the heat, there would have been time for the kind of conversation that only long and unhurried travel makes possible, the conversation that ranges freely across everything, that is not driven by urgency or agenda but by simple curiosity and the pleasure of the exchange of ideas between two people who are genuinely interested in each other and in the world. What Caesar and Cleopatra talked about on that barge, in the weeks they moved through Egypt together, is not recorded and cannot be recovered, but the fact that both of them were people of wide intellectual range and genuine curiosity, that Caesar was writing and thinking about grammar and astronomy as well as military tactics during the years of his greatest political prominence, and that Cleopatra had the library of Alexandria in her memory and several thousand years of Egyptian civilization in her landscape, suggests that the conversation was neither shallow nor dull. The Nile in flood was one of the most extraordinary sights in the ancient world, and Cleopatra would have seen it many times, would have stood at the palace windows or at the edge of the delta fields and watched the river rise in its slow and inexorable way, the water spreading from the channel across the flat land in a great brown sheet, carrying with it the dark silt from the mountains of the interior, the silt that was the source of all Egyptian fertility, the gift that the Ethiopians gave to Egypt every year through the medium of the river without knowing or intending it, the gift that made Egypt what it was, the gift without which there was no Egypt at all, only desert. The inundation began in late June, when the dog star Sirius rose just before the sun in the early morning sky, the sign that the Egyptians had used for millennia to mark the beginning of the flood season, and it rose through July and August until it reached its peak, the ideal flood being one that covered the fields to a depth of several cubits, deep enough to saturate the soil and deposit its layer of silt, but not so deep that it destroyed the buildings and the infrastructure of the villages and the farming communities along the bank. When the water receded in September and October, it left behind the black earth, the Kemet, the black land that gave Egypt its name and its identity, distinguishing it from the red desert that surrounded it on all sides, the red land, the Deshret, which was the land of chaos and death, and the black land, which was the land of life and order and the endless renewal that the river made possible. She understood this cycle not just intellectually but viscerally, in the way that a ruler who has genuinely entered the life of her people understands the things that matter most to them, the things on which their survival depends, and she managed the agricultural administration of Egypt with attention to these rhythms, maintaining the system of irrigation canals and storage facilities and tax records and market regulations that converted the Nile's annual gift into the prosperity that made Egypt the most valuable single piece of real estate in the ancient world, the kingdom that every great power wanted to control, because whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain supply of the Mediterranean. She was also, in those months of the winter and spring, in Alexandria with Caesar, conducting the kind of complex political management that the situation required, negotiating the end of the Alexandrian War, securing her position on the Egyptian throne, managing the relationship with Rome that was both a necessity and a danger for a small and wealthy kingdom at the eastern edge of the Roman world, keeping in balance the various interests and factions of the Alexandrian court, maintaining her relationship with the Egyptian priestly class, whose religious authority and popular influence were essential to the legitimacy of any Egyptian ruler. She was doing all of this while also being pregnant with Caesar's child, a pregnancy that resulted in the birth of a son whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, known to the Alexandrians as Caesarion, Little Caesar, the son of the greatest Roman of the age and the Queen of Egypt, a child whose very existence was a statement about the relationship between Rome and Egypt and about the ambitions and the intentions of the woman who bore him. Caesar left Egypt in the summer of 47, called back to the pressing military business of the Roman world, and Cleopatra was left to govern Egypt alone, which she did with the administrative competence and the political intelligence that characterized everything she did. The years between Caesar's departure and the famous meeting with Mark Antony were years of governing, years of attending to the practical business of a wealthy and complex kingdom, managing the flood cycle of the Nile and the agricultural output of the delta and the trade that came through Alexandria from the east and the south and the west, managing the religious institutions of Egypt and the Greek community of Alexandria and the Jewish community that was one of the largest and most important in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria at its height contained, according to the ancient estimates, perhaps 500,000 scrolls, a number so large as to be almost incomprehensible in the context of the ancient world, where books were made by hand on fragile materials, where the copying of a long text was the work of months and the accumulation of a substantial library was the work of generations. The Ptolemies had built this collection over 2 centuries of systematic acquisition, sending agents to every city and every kingdom in the known world to purchase or borrow or copy texts, examining the baggage of every ship that put into the harbor of Alexandria for books that might be needed, maintaining a staff of scholars whose work was not only the care of the collection but the active production of new knowledge, the writing of commentaries and critiques and original works that extended the library's holdings in every generation. Cleopatra moved through this collection with the freedom and the familiarity of someone who had grown up in its company, who knew where things were and what they contained and how they related to each other, who could move from the works of Euclid to the medical texts of Herophilus to the geographical writings of Eratosthenes to the philosophical dialogues of Plato and find in each of them something relevant to the question she was currently carrying. She was, by the standards of her time and perhaps by any standard, remarkably well read, not in the way of the scholar who reads to demonstrate erudition but in the way of the person who reads because the questions she is trying to answer keep leading her to more books, because every text she reads opens 3 more that she needs to read, because knowledge is not a destination but a landscape that expands as you move through it. Always more of it ahead than you have covered behind. The physical experience of working with ancient texts was very different from reading a book in the modern sense. The scrolls had to be unrolled as you read them, held open between both hands or wound around a wooden cylinder, the text running in narrow columns from top to bottom of the papyrus, read by lamplight or by the diffuse light that came through the high windows of the library's reading rooms. And this physical engagement with the material was itself part of the experience of reading, part of the relationship between the reader and the text, a relationship that was intimate in a way that the modern printed book, with its fixed and permanent form, does not quite replicate. The administration of Egypt under Cleopatra was an administration of considerable complexity. The country was divided into nomes, administrative districts each with its own governor and its own local administration, and the management of these districts, the collection of taxes and the maintenance of the irrigation infrastructure and the regulation of trade and the management of the temple estates that controlled large portions of the agricultural land, required a degree of organizational competence and a depth of knowledge about the country that could only be acquired through years of serious attention. Cleopatra had given it this attention. She had traveled through Egypt, had visited the temples and the farming communities and the trading ports, had held audience with the priests and the local administrators and the merchants and the farmers, had asked questions and listened to the answers and formed, over years, a detailed and accurate picture of the kingdom she governed that informed every decision she made. The economy of Egypt in the 1st century before the Common Era was an economy based primarily on agriculture and trade, the agriculture of the Nile Delta and the trade routes that connected Egypt to the Mediterranean world to the north and west and to Arabia and India and the African interior to the south and east. Alexandria was the hub through which these trade routes ran, the port through which the spices and the silks and the precious stones and the exotic animals that the wealthy world desired passed on their way from their places of origin to their places of consumption, and the revenues generated by this trade were the foundation of the Ptolemaic treasury and of the extraordinary wealth that made Egypt the most desired prize in the ancient world. She managed this economy with a combination of traditional practices and her own innovations, maintaining the systems of state control over key commodities that the Ptolemies had developed and that gave the crown a degree of economic leverage that private enterprise alone could not have provided, while also encouraging the trade and the craftsmanship and the intellectual work that made Alexandria the cosmopolitan center it was. The mint at Alexandria struck coins that circulated throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and the standard of the coin and the administration of the monetary system were elements of governance that she attended to with the same seriousness she gave to everything else. She was a careful administrator, attentive to the details of governance in a way that the historical record, which tends to focus on the dramatic events at the expense of the ordinary ones, does not always represent fairly. There are records from her reign that show her attention to agricultural tax rates during years of poor flooding, to the regulation of weights and measures in the markets of Alexandria, to the management of the grain stores that were the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, to the diplomatic correspondence with the kingdoms and powers on Egypt's borders. She governed a country of perhaps 7 million people, a country of extraordinary cultural and religious diversity, in a period of significant political instability in the wider Mediterranean world, and she governed it with a stability and a prosperity that the historical evidence generally supports. The death of Caesar on the 15th of March in 44 before the Common Era, stabbed in the Senate by men who feared what he was becoming, was a catastrophe that reached Cleopatra in Alexandria as news that arrived across the Mediterranean by ship, news that was days or weeks old by the time it arrived, but that was no less devastating for its delayed arrival. Because what Caesar's death meant for Cleopatra was the loss of her most important protector in the Roman world, the loss of the relationship that had given her reign a security in its dealings with Rome that no other arrangement could have provided. She was with her son Caesarion when the news came. The boy was about 3 years old, a child who looked, those who knew him said, very much like his father, a resemblance that was both precious to Cleopatra and politically dangerous, the living proof of a relationship that some Romans found convenient to deny or to minimize. She held this child and she thought about what Caesar's death meant, and she proceeded, as she always proceeded, with the clarity and the practical determination that were her defining characteristics, assessing what had changed and what remained the same and what needed to be done in the new configuration of power that Caesar's murder had created. What it created, after the initial confusion and the first arrangements, was a struggle between Caesar's named heir Octavian, who was only 18 years old but who proved to be a political operator of the highest order, and Caesar's lieutenant and friend Mark Antony, who commanded the loyalty of Caesar's legions and who was, in the years immediately after Caesar's death, the dominant military power in the Roman world. Cleopatra watched this struggle from Alexandria, governing Egypt and maintaining its productive neutrality while the two most powerful men in the Roman world sorted out between them who would control the East and who would control the West, and when the sorting out was done and Mark Antony emerged as the ruler of the Eastern Mediterranean, including the regions closest to Egypt, the moment came for the meeting that would define the last decade of her life. She was summoned to meet Antony at Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, in the year 41 before the Common Era, and she went, but she went in the way that she always went to meetings that mattered, with full attention to the manner and the effect of her arrival, with the understanding that how you arrive is itself a message and that the message she needed to send to Mark Antony was one of power and confidence and the particular kind of regal magnificence that was available to the Queen of the richest kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean. She arrived on a barge, the ancient sources tell us, with purple sails and silver oars and incense burning on the deck, and herself dressed and positioned as the goddess Aphrodite, as if the goddess of love had come to meet the man who presented himself as the god Dionysus, as if this meeting of two of the most powerful people in the world was also a meeting of divine forces, a spectacle of mythological proportions. The barge on the river Cydnus was the theatrical expression of a political calculation, the kind of calculated display that Cleopatra had been making all her adult life, the conscious orchestration of image and impression in the service of actual power, and it worked as she intended it to work, because Antony was a man who responded to magnificence, who was himself drawn to the dramatic and the excessive and the beautiful, whose character had a largeness and a warmth and a vulnerability to pleasure that made him susceptible to exactly the kind of encounter that Cleopatra had arranged. He expected to receive her, to be in the position of the powerful man receiving the subject queen, and she reversed this arrangement entirely, and this reversal was not just an aesthetic gesture but a political one, a demonstration that Egypt was not a subject kingdom to be received at a conqueror's table but a partner to be met with equal ceremony and equal dignity. The winters that Antony spent in Alexandria were winters that the ancient sources describe in the hyperbolic language of Roman disapproval, presenting them as seasons of pure indulgence, banquets that lasted through the night and games and elaborate entertainments, and while there was certainly pleasure in those winters, certainly the particular pleasure that Alexandria was uniquely qualified to provide, the ancient accounts miss entirely the other dimensions of what those months contained. Antony was not a stupid man, and Alexandria was not merely a pleasure city but the intellectual capital of the world, and the months he spent there were also months of education, months of being in the presence of the library and of Cleopatra's extraordinary mind and of the scholars and philosophers who gathered at the Ptolemaic court, months of conversation about the history of the East and the nature of divine kingship and the relationship between Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion. Conversations that a Roman general might not have had anywhere else and that, by all evidence, he found genuinely engaging. The evenings in the great banqueting hall of the palace were not the debauched spectacles that the Roman sources describe but were, in the Hellenistic tradition, events of considerable cultural sophistication, occasions at which poets and musicians and philosophers as well as soldiers and politicians were present, at which the conversation was expected to be worthy of the company and the company was expected to be capable of sustaining it. Cleopatra presided over these evenings with the same combination of warmth and intellectual authority that she brought to everything, the hostess and the queen and the most learned person in the room all at once, moving between these roles with the ease of someone for whom they were not distinct roles but aspects of a single identity. She and Antony formed, those who knew them agreed, a company that was genuinely good, a friendship as well as a political alliance and a love affair, the friendship of two people who found in each other a combination of qualities they had not expected to find together in the same person, who made each other laugh as well as think, who were at ease with each other in the particular way that ease develops between people who have passed through difficulty together and have found in the other the quality that difficulty most requires, which is steadiness, the willingness to be present and honest and not to pretend that what is difficult is not difficult. The relationship that developed from that first meeting in Tarsus and that continued through the last decade of Cleopatra's life was, by the evidence available to us, genuinely complex and genuinely deep, a relationship that contained real political calculation and also, by all indications, real affection and real understanding between two people who were, in their very different ways, both people of exceptional quality. Antony was not, like Caesar, a man of the highest intellectual distinction, was not a writer or a philosopher or a man whose mind was drawn naturally to the world of ideas, but he was a man of great personal warmth and physical courage and genuine generosity, a man who inspired deep loyalty in the people who served under him and whose company was, by all accounts, enormously pleasurable, full of the ease and humor and directness that distinguished the best soldiers of the Roman world. He came to Alexandria in the winter of 41–40, and the city received him and he received the city, and what Alexandria offered a man of his particular temperament was something it was uniquely qualified to offer, the most beautiful city in the world, with its harbor and its library and its cosmopolitan mixture of cultures and its queen who could speak to him in his own language and in the languages of all the peoples around them and who presided over her court with a combination of intellectual command and personal warmth that was, in his experience, entirely without parallel. The winters that Antony spent in Alexandria were winters that the ancient sources describe in terms of elaborate pleasure, of banquets and games and excursions and entertainments of all kinds, and while these accounts carry the distorting lens of Roman disapproval, the lens of a culture that regarded Alexandria as decadent and regarded the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra as a Roman man being unmanned by a foreign queen. The underlying reality they are describing seems to be simpler and less morally freighted than their telling of it, the reality of two powerful and capable people who enjoyed each other's company enormously and who had created together, in the palace by the harbor in Alexandria, a life that was both politically serious and personally joyful. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy and a girl, in 40 BC, and several years later another son, and these children were raised in the palace alongside Caesarion, the children of the two most important political relationships of her adult life, and they were raised, as she had been raised, in the environment of the most educated city in the world, with the library and the tutors and the cosmopolitan mixture of cultures that Alexandria uniquely offered. She was a devoted mother by the evidence available, a woman for whom the welfare of her children was among the most important considerations in all the political calculations of her later years. The relationship with Antony deepened and complicated over the years, moving through periods of separation when he was away in the East fighting his campaigns and periods of reunion in Alexandria, moving through the political events that were reshaping the Roman world and that were, inexorably, narrowing the space available for the kind of independent power that Cleopatra had maintained with such skill. Octavian, Caesar's heir, was winning the long competition with Antony through a combination of genuine political genius and an extraordinary ability to shape public perception, turning Antony's relationship with Cleopatra into a political liability for Antony in Rome, presenting it as evidence of Roman virtues corrupted by Eastern decadence, building in the Roman public mind an image of Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress who had captured Rome's greatest general and turned him away from his Roman duties. This image was, as most political images are, a significant distortion of a more complicated reality, but it was effective, and its effectiveness was one of the things that made the final conflict between Antony and Octavian, when it came, so damaging to Antony's cause. The Battle of Actium, fought in September of 31 before the Common Era off the coast of western Greece, was the decisive military engagement that settled the competition between them, and it went decisively in Octavian's favor, and in its aftermath Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria and the situation that had given them their power and their freedom began to collapse around them. The last year of Cleopatra's life, from the defeat at Actium in 31 to her death in August of 30 BC, was a year lived in the face of an enclosing catastrophe, a year in which everything she had built and maintained and protected for 2 decades was being dismantled, slowly and then with increasing speed, as Octavian's forces moved toward Egypt from the west and the allegiances that had sustained Antony's position in the east shifted and evaporated. She managed this year with the same composure and the same strategic intelligence she had always brought to difficult circumstances, exploring every diplomatic option, attempting to secure the future of her children, maintaining the administration of Egypt even as the world around it was changing in ways that she could not reverse. Antony died first, in August of 30 BC, in circumstances that were confused and tragic, believing in his last moments that Cleopatra had already died, and Cleopatra survived him by only a short time, dying on the 12th of August in the same year, 11 days after his death. She was 39 years old. The manner of her death is one of the most famous stories in all of history, the story of the asp, the Egyptian cobra whose bite was sacred in Egypt, associated with the goddess Wadjet and with the royal uraeus that the pharaohs wore on their brows, the cobra whose venom killed quickly and, it was believed, painlessly, and whose bite was regarded as a form of divine touch, a way of entering death that was also a form of apotheosis, the queen becoming one with the goddess she had always claimed to be. Whether she died by snakebite or by some other means is a question that historians have debated for 2,000 years. What is not in question is that she chose the manner and the moment of her death, that she died not as a prisoner to be displayed in Octavian's triumph through Rome but as a queen who remained, in the end, in control of the one thing that no conqueror could take from her, the decision of when and how her life would end. She was found, the ancient sources say, dressed in her royal robes and arranged on her golden bed in the position of a sleeping queen, as if even in death she was presenting herself with the care and the deliberateness that she had brought to every other presentation of herself throughout her life. She was buried alongside Antony, in the tomb she had been preparing in Alexandria, and with her death the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years came to an end, and Egypt became a province of Rome, a possession of Octavian who would soon become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the extraordinary world that Alexandria had represented. The world of the library and the lighthouse and the mixed cultures and the Greek-speaking pharaohs who learned Egyptian to speak to their gods, was absorbed into the larger world of Roman power and in time gave way to other worlds, other cultures, other arrangements of power. But before all of that, before the end, there were the days on the Nile barge, moving slowly through the flat Egyptian light with the sound of the oars in the water and the smell of incense from the little braziers on the deck and the great temple facades passing slowly on either bank, their carved faces of gods and pharaohs looking out at the river with the same expression they had worn for 1,000 years and would wear for 1,000 more. There were the mornings in the palace in Alexandria when the harbor was calm and the sea beyond it was the particular blue-green that it only was in the early morning, before the sun climbed high enough to turn it white, and the gulls were moving in slow circles above the ships and the smell of the sea was fresh and cool in the rooms that faced north, and the day was still ahead, full of the work of governing and thinking and talking and learning that made her life, whatever else it was, a life of exceptional engagement with the world. There were the evenings in the great dining hall when the lamps were lit and the food came in from the kitchens and the musicians played in the gallery above and the conversation ranged across the table in Greek and Latin and Egyptian and the mixed dialect that the Alexandrians spoke among themselves, a dialect that was itself a testament to the city's singular character, the product of centuries of cultural mixing. There were the afternoons in the library, moving through the rolls of papyrus and the wooden tablets and the folded codices in their wooden cases, the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of human civilization arranged in the cool dimness of the great building while outside the sun blazed on the marble and the sea sparkled in the harbor and the lighthouse on the Pharos cast its steady beam across the water. There was the study of languages, each one a door opening onto a different way of organizing the world, the Egyptian hieroglyphs that were themselves a kind of picture of what they described, the abstract Greek script that built meaning from pure sound, the flowing Aramaic that moved from right to left in cursive streams across the papyrus, the angular Hebrew that carried in its letters the weight of a very ancient covenant, the Latin that was practical and clear and built for the management of empire, and all of them in her mind simultaneously, all of them available when she needed them, a linguistic richness that was itself a form of wealth, a form of access to the world that no amount of gold could purchase for those who lacked the gift to use it. There was the study of the Egyptian gods, Isis and Osiris and Horus and Ra, and all the vast and intricate pantheon of the Egyptian religious tradition, gods who were not abstractions but presences, not metaphors but forces, the gods whose images lined the temple walls and whose names were written in the hieroglyphic inscriptions and whose power the Egyptians had invoked and propitiated and been sustained by for 3,000 years. And Cleopatra's presentation of herself as the daughter of Isis was not merely political theater but was, in the Egyptian religious understanding that she had genuinely made her own, a statement about the nature of royal power and its relationship to the divine, a statement that the people she governed recognized and responded to with a depth of feeling that their Greek-speaking ancestors had never been able to access. And there was the Nile, always the Nile, the great river that was the ground of everything, that rose and fell with the astronomical precision of the natural world, and that in its rising and falling governed the whole economy and the whole religious life of Egypt, the river whose flood the Egyptians watched each year with the particular mixture of hope and anxiety that attends any event on which the whole of life depends, watching for the first signs of the rise in late June and tracking its progress through July and August with the Nilometers that stood in the river at various points along its course, watching the water climb on the marked stones and calculating from its height whether this year would bring the deep and fertile flood that filled the land with grain and prosperity, or the shallow flood that meant a lean year and the deep flood that meant inundation beyond recovery. To understand Egypt, Cleopatra understood, was to understand the Nile. To govern Egypt was to govern in accordance with the river's rhythms, to work with the natural cycles that had shaped the country and its people for longer than any political arrangement had existed, to respect the deep relationship between the land and the water and the sky and the people who lived in that relationship and had made it holy. This understanding was what set her apart from her Ptolemaic ancestors, who had governed Egypt without ever really understanding it, who had taken its wealth and commanded its labor and left its culture to continue largely on its own terms without ever entering into it, and it was what made her, for the people of Egypt, a different kind of ruler than any they had had in more than 2 centuries. A ruler who spoke their language and worshipped their gods and stood in the temples in the posture of the pharaoh and made the ancient formulas of devotion in the ancient tongue. The Alexandria she presided over was, even in its last years, a place of extraordinary life, a place where the light on the harbor in the early morning was unlike any light anywhere else in the world, and where the library held within it the memory of everything the human mind had thought and observed and imagined up to that point, and where the people who moved through its streets came from every part of the known world and brought with them every language and every custom and every way of understanding what the world was and how a person should live in it, and where all of this diversity was somehow held together in a single city that was, despite everything, and for all the violence and the politics and the eventual tragedy that attended its history, one of the most remarkable human achievements of the ancient world, a demonstration of what the meeting of cultures can produce when it is allowed to be genuinely productive rather than merely coercive. There is something in the manner of her death that is, even at this distance of 2,000 years, deeply moving, not because it was tragic in the way that untimely death is always tragic, though it was certainly that, but because of what it reveals about the consistency of her character, the way in which the woman who came to Caesar in Alexandria wrapped in a carpet and the woman who arranged herself on the golden bed in her royal robes were the same woman throughout, always conscious of the image she presented to the world and what that image said about the nature of royal power and the dignity of Egypt. She had, in the weeks after Antony's death, been negotiating with Octavian, the negotiations of a woman exploring every possibility with the thoroughness and the intelligence that she had always brought to negotiation, exploring the question of whether there was any arrangement under which Egypt's independence might be preserved, whether Caesarion might be protected, whether anything at all of what she had built and governed and cared for might survive the change that was coming. Octavian had no intention of granting her any of these things, but he maintained the appearance of negotiation because he needed her alive for his triumph in Rome, needed the spectacle of the Egyptian queen being led in chains through the streets of the city to demonstrate the completeness of his victory. She understood this. She was too intelligent not to understand it, and she made her choice in full understanding of what it meant, the choice to deny Octavian his spectacle, to die as a queen on her own terms in her own time in her own city, wearing the robes of her office and lying on the golden bed in the posture of a sleeping sovereign, her two attendants Iras and Charmion beside her, faithful to the end. The small blue marks on her arm that were the only sign of how the end had come. Charmion, it is said, was still adjusting the queen's diadem when Octavian's soldiers arrived at the chamber, and when one of the soldiers demanded of her whether this was well done, she answered, according to Plutarch, that it was very well done, and worthy of the descendant of so many kings, and then she died herself, and the chamber was quiet, and the harbor of Alexandria sparkled outside the window in the August sun. Let the mind rest now in that city, in the Alexandria that was and that in some sense still is, the idea of it persisting in the memory of civilization even though the buildings are gone and the library burned and the lighthouse fallen into the sea long centuries ago. Let the harbor be still in the early morning, the water the color of green glass in the first light, the ships at anchor moving gently on the slight swell, the lighthouse on the Pharos still shining, its light moving across the dark water in a slow and patient arc, reaching out to the ships that are still at sea, guiding them toward the harbor, toward the city, toward the light. Let the palace be quiet in the hours before the court assembles, the corridors cool and fragrant with the cedarwood and the lotus blossom and the morning air coming in through the seaward windows, the sound of the fountain in the courtyard below, steady and soft. Let the day begin slowly, as days in warm climates begin, the light coming in gradually over the flat eastern horizon and spreading across the harbor and the buildings and the streets with a gentleness and a generosity that suggests the sun is in no hurry, that there is time for everything, that the world is patient, that the questions will keep and the decisions can wait until the mind has had its hour of quiet, its hour of simply being present to the light and the water and the sound of the city waking around it. And let the Nile be there, always the Nile, somewhere not far beyond the city, moving toward the sea in its unhurried and inevitable way, carrying with it the silt of the mountains of the interior, the dark rich silt that would settle on the delta fields in the autumn when the flood receded and would lie there through the winter and the spring, feeding the grain and the vegetables and the fruit that fed the people of Egypt and, through the trade that left the harbor of Alexandria in the great merchant ships, fed much of the ancient world. The river as it has always been, patient and generous and entirely indifferent to the dramas of the people who live along its banks, going about its ancient business of moving water from the mountains to the sea, knowing nothing of queens or conquerors, knowing only the long slope of the land and the pull of gravity and the distant smell of the Mediterranean waiting at the end of its journey. Now let the evening come, the long Egyptian evening that arrives with particular beauty, the sky turning through shades of orange and rose and violet above the harbor, the first stars appearing in the east before the last of the daylight has left the western horizon, the lamps being lit in the palace windows and their warm light appearing on the surface of the water below, little reflections that move and dance as the water moves, and the city settling into the particular quietness of a warm evening, the people moving more slowly in the cooling air, the conversations in the streets becoming more leisurely, the urgent business of the day giving way to the more relaxed business of the evening. Let the queen be at her window, looking out over the harbor, looking at the lighthouse sending its patient beam across the darkening water, and let her be simply looking, for this moment, not governing or calculating or negotiating or managing the endless complex requirements of her position, simply looking at the harbor and the sea and the lighthouse and the stars coming out above them, looking with the quality of attention that she brought to everything, the attention that never grew tired, that found in the familiar scene something new to notice in each new hour of observation, the way the water changed its color in the last light, the way the reflections of the harbor lamps lengthened as the surface of the water stilled in the diminishing wind of evening. Let the thought of kingdoms and of Rome and of the competition of powers that filled the waking hours of her life grow quiet now. Let it recede into the background where it always was, but where in this particular evening hour it is less insistent, less pressing, where there is room between the thought and the next thought for the sound of the water against the harbor wall and the distant crying of the gulls settling for the night and the very faint music from somewhere in the palace behind her. And let all of these sounds blend together into the particular texture of an evening in Alexandria, the texture of a city that was always, even in its most difficult years, a beautiful place to be. And then let the window be closed against the night air, and let the lamp be turned down low, and let the room be quiet, and let the sound of the sea be still audible but gentle now, a soft and steady sound that has no urgency in it, that asks nothing and promises nothing and simply accompanies the slow unwinding of the day into the larger quiet of the night. The same sound that the Mediterranean has made along this particular coast for all the centuries before Cleopatra and for all the centuries after, the same patient and indifferent sound that the sea makes everywhere it meets the land, the sound of a world that is much older than any of the things that happen on its surface and that will continue long after the last traces of those things have been absorbed and erased. Let the breath slow now, let the body settle, let the mind release the last of the day's considerations and rest in the quiet where everything is equal, where the queen and the servant and the scholar and the sailor are all equally held in the same darkness, the same silence, the same large and patient night. Let the stars continue to move in their slow arcs above Alexandria, above the lighthouse and the library and the palace and the harbor, the same stars that guided the ships into harbor, that the astronomers in the library had mapped and measured and named, that the Egyptians had watched for thousands of years and organized into the shapes of their gods, always moving, always returning, always keeping the particular faith of the natural world, which is the faith of things that do what they are made to do without deviation or disappointment, the faith of the river that flows toward the sea and the tide that answers the moon and the sun that rises every morning over the flat horizon of the eastern desert and fills the world again with the light that makes everything visible, that makes the harbor blue-green and the white buildings shimmer and the face of the woman at the window turn toward the sea glow with the particular warmth and the particular intelligence of a person who is, in this moment, entirely present, entirely alive, entirely herself. And let the mind drift now, as minds drift on the edge of sleep, through the rooms and the harbors and the river bends that this story has gathered, through the garden in the morning before the lessons began, through the library in the cool of the afternoon, through the barge on the Nile with the temples passing slowly on the banks and the smell of incense on the warm air, through the winter evenings in the banqueting hall with the lamps and the music and the company of the most interesting people in the world, through the desert nights of exile with the enormous stars overhead and the silence of the ancient landscape around, through all the years of governing and thinking and caring for the country and the people and the children and the library and everything that was worth caring for. Let none of it be urgent. Let it all be simply present for a moment, the way a landscape is present when you look at it from a high place, all of it visible at once, all of it held in the same clear air, none of it more important than any other part of it, just the whole of a life arranged before the eye of the mind like a view from a hillside, or from a lighthouse, or from the high windows of a palace beside a harbor where the ships are at anchor and the sea is blue-green and the lighthouse is sending its light across. The water and the stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Let Isis spread her wings across the sky as she did in the Egyptian paintings, her blue-black wings stretching from horizon to horizon, encompassing everything, protecting everything, holding the world together in the gesture of eternal maternal love that the Egyptians had been making since before the pyramids were built, the gesture that says, everything is held, everything is contained, nothing falls through, the world is cared for. Sleep now, as the evening comes over Alexandria, as the lamps are lit in the harbor and the lighthouse begins its nightly vigil, as the last traders close their stalls and the last ships furl their sails and the city settles into the quietness that the dark always brings, the democratic quietness of night that belongs to no queen and no conqueror, that is the inheritance of every creature that lives under the sky. Sleep with the sound of the sea in the distance and the smell of cedarwood and lotus blossom in the air and the stars moving slowly overhead in the patterns that the Egyptians gave them the names of gods, and let the world be very old and very patient and very large, much larger than any single life, much more enduring than any single kingdom, and let this be a comfort, and let it be enough, and let sleep come as the tide comes, gently and inevitably, filling all the spaces where the day has been, covering everything with its soft and equal darkness, and let everything be still.